Okay, so
That's not an argument. That was just prattling.
The direct example was Kamala Harris promoted the Minnesota Freedom Fund, and which was set to bail out protesters. And among those, you have George Howard, who was bailed out on August 6th, who was arrested on a domestic violence charge. And then later that month, on August 29th, he was arrested again, accused of murder in a shooting.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Really glad you made it here today. So what you are about to watch is one of those debates that genuinely caught me off guard. John Paul, a conservative student from UC Berkeley of all places, goes head-to-head against Soy Pill and Vince Wilson on one of the most charged questions in American politics right now. Which political party carries more responsibility for political violence in this country? And what makes this one different is that it does not stay theoretical for long. Real names, real events, real money trails get brought to the table. And at one point, someone on the opposing side says something so unexpected that the whole room goes quiet. Make sure you stay all the way through because the moment that flips this entire conversation happens later than you think. And trust me, you do not want to miss it. Also, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you are watching this from. I genuinely love seeing where you all are tuning in from. It always surprises me. All right, let us get into it.
Care. In fact, he's actually called Kamala Harris a fascist, a communist, a Marxist. We've seen Stephen Miller saying the same thing, echoing the same thing. Yet I haven't heard anybody mention anything about Donald Trump saying those words. Because it's okay when the right does it, but when the left does it, somehow now it's all sorts of crazy.
Yeah, right? So you have
There's lots of lies. There's lots of lies there. I mean, first
totally.
Where's the lies?
You said he didn't condemn it. January 7th, he released a statement saying, "I would like to begin by addressing the heinous attack on the United States Capitol. Like all Americans, I am outraged by the violence, lawlessness, and mayhem.
So outraged,
I immediately deployed the National Guard."
I thought he didn't condemn him 5 seconds ago, you lying gutless fuck.
Guys, both of you, is that condemning? Is that condemning?
I don't call it condemning if he ends up, and I don't call it condemning if he ends up after the fact pardoning.
Okay, do you know how much violence actually was on January 6th? Do you know how much violence actually was there?
There was probably, I think there was over 100 people that were charged. There was about 170 people charged with assaulting a law enforcement officer.
Were any of them charged with insurrection, fuckhead?
60.
No, none of them were charged with insurrection, fuckhead. Not a single one.
170 people were charged with assaulting.
Were there any of them charged with insurrection?
Andrew, you're boxing shadows right now. No one's talking about insurrection.
Yes, that's what you guys just said. You just said it was a seditious insurrection 5 seconds ago.
It's a seditious conspiracy. That's not the same thing.
Oh, so it wasn't an insurrection?
I said it was seditious.
So what? I just want to be clear. Then it wasn't an insurrection.
I'd say that any definition.
I don't know what this has to do with any of the.
I just want to make sure that we're clear. Was it an insurrection or not? Was it?
It was a seditious conspiracy.
Okay, so it wasn't an insurrection. Got it.
There's nothing inconsistent about this. You can completely condemn the violence that occurred, which
and then pardon them afterwards. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And you can pardon.
That sounds like a dog whistle to me, John. I don't know. I mean, he's speaking out of both sides of his mouth. On one side, he said condemn. On the other side, he said.
How would you know? You won't let him finish what he's saying.
Everyone, I'm going to let John Paul go first, and then Soy, you can respond.
Now, my understanding is you have people who are outside of the Capitol who are recording it. Some people who are even let inside the building, almost walking in like a tour, not really causing much violence, who go and serve years of jail time, along with other people who maybe, like, if they were violent, they also served jail time. And you can pardon those people on the basis that you think that they were either serving a term that was way too long, which was the case when you have many people who were simply trespassing, for instance, spending years and years of jail time and fines. And you can pardon those people while also saying that the violence was absolutely outrageous. And Vincent, you said that Donald Trump never condemned the January 6th attack, when I just read to you the statement he released right after, calling it a heinous attack, saying what he did to try to stop it, and condemning the violence.
What did he do afterwards, John?
How many years afterwards?
Wait, hold on.
4 years later.
Hold on. So next. Hold on.
Yeah, how can you claim that he thinks the violence is outrageous if he thinks they did nothing wrong and pardon them for it? If he's pardoning everyone, like, I agree, there are people in there that maybe shouldn't be in jail for 20 years for trespassing or whatever ridiculous thing, but someone who's committing seditious conspiracy, planning to overthrow the government, someone who beat up police officers, any of these violent rioters are also pardoned. How can you possibly say that he thinks that violence is outrageous if he thinks you should get zero punishment for it?
He did not pardon every single individual. But additionally, what I'm going to do actually is I'm going to steel man your position. I'm going to assume that you are completely correct in what you're saying. There's two main problems. The one main problem is that whenever we give actions done by Kamala Harris and other politicians, we see you and Vincent constantly is saying like, oh, well, she condemned the action, so it's okay.
Wait, John,
and that's
to be
the only
clear,
proof.
in
That's
good
the
faith, I
only
asked you
defense.
this. Can you show me the person that she retweeted in this fund? And if they did something that was a violent action, I actually agree with you. I would say that is the closest thing that you have shown me to a left winger saying tacitly that violence is okay.
This is where everything shifts, because Vince opened this section with what he thought was a strong double standard argument, saying the right uses the same inflammatory language as the left, and nobody holds them accountable for it. And then John Paul responded immediately. He said the official statement was released the very next day, and he read it out loud on stream. John Paul read this directly. I would like to begin by addressing the heinous attack on the United States Capitol. Like all Americans, I am outraged by the violence and lawlessness. And what does Vince say? I am quoting Vince directly here. Is that condemning? I don't call it condemning. Stop. Stop. He spent the entire debate demanding condemnation. He received a documented public statement with the word heinous in it. And his response was, I do not count that. That is not someone engaging with evidence. That is someone who locked in their conclusion before the debate even started and is refusing to let any fact interfere with it. But here is what I find even more interesting. The moment John Paul corners the other side on the difference between seditious conspiracy and insurrection, there is no real response. And this distinction actually matters. Most people genuinely do not know this. Seditious conspiracy under federal law means conspiring to oppose or obstruct government authority. Insurrection is a completely separate charge. It means an active armed uprising against the state itself. These are not the same legal standard. Not one person involved was ever charged with insurrection. Not a single count filed. So every time that word was used in this debate, it was invoking a charge that was never brought, never prosecuted, never even presented to a grand jury, and John Paul simply said it was a seditious conspiracy, so it was not an insurrection. Got it. That quiet response lands harder than any yelling, because he just made the other side confirm the truth out of their own mouth.
Bailing them out. I've actually said that. For all these other things, every single left-wing politician is saying this is awful, we condemn it, and their actions are not indicating of anything otherwise. They're not pardoning violent people. But if you do show me that specific fund and the specific person and what they did was violent, yeah, I'd say, yeah, that is actually tacitly endorsing violence, and I wouldn't agree with that. But that is, in totality, so
wait a
far
second.
fewer than
I just
all
want to
these
make sure,
examples
hang
we
on,
talked about
can
the
I
right.
make sure I got this right? So if I show you a bunch of tweets from left-wing politicians post Kirk's death, who literally strawman his positions and say that he was a racist fascist, you don't consider that to be some sort of like, I don't know.
I'd say that's an accurate description of objective reality.
Okay, so the thing is like that's not them basically giving a pass, right?
No, it's
No,
not, because
of
they
course
don't
not.
need
You
to
wanted
give
an
an
So to
example.
hang
They
on,
don't
so to
give
get
that's
this
the
right,
only option.
hang on. I just want to make sure so I get this right.
Mhm.
So when it comes to Charlie Kirk, they can condemn the violence out of one side of their mouth, and then on the other side, they can say that, well, but he was a racist, misogynist, Nazi, right? But John Paul, when he brings up, well, okay, Trump can condemn the violence, right? But also give them pardons, later on because he thought that the prison sentences were far too stiff. Why is it that you think that argument would work against John, but not against you in the same context?
Left-wing politicians pardoning people committing violence,
Here,
which
you
is why
want an
I gave
example,
the
right?
example. If you're showing her saying, let's bail out people who committed violence, I would say, yes, that is pretty similar and something I would not be okay with, versus people accurately describing his ideology, which you say it can only lead to violence, which you actually had to caveat and say, well, it's only going to lead to violence because although everyone really understands that's not necessarily the only way you can deal with a fascist, a bunch of crazy people are going to get the wrong idea. But the crazy people on the right, when Donald Trump calls us fascists, I mean, they don't listen to him. Like, I just don't understand how you think these two things are even close to equal.
Okay, so if
That's
you
not
want
an
example, the
argument. That was
direct
just
example-
paddling.
Hold on.
The
No, you just
direct
didn't
direct
understand it. I
example was
understand.
Kamala Harris promoted the Minnesota Freedom Fund,
Mhm.
and which was set to bail out protesters.
Mhm.
And among those, you have George Howard, who was bailed out on August 6th,
Okay.
who was arrested on a domestic violence charge. And then later that month, on August 29th, he was arrested again, accused of murder in a shooting. And so you have Kamala Harris retweeting the Minnesota Freedom Fund and telling people to donate to
Wait,
it.
you don't have to explain
bail
further. I
out people
completely
like this.
agree. I think that was incredibly irresponsible of Kamala Harris. I think that contributed. I could say you could even tie this directly to her and other politicians who retweeted this stuff for all of the violence that came out of anyone bailed out by that fund. I would say, ideologically consistent, that is not okay. In the same way that Joe Biden mass pardoned these like a bunch of drug dealers who may now go out and do more crime. I think that is awful.
And his
But if we're gonna
son?
talk about what?
And his son.
Well, I don't know if his,
And
I
his
think
son?
his son's reformed. His son is reformed. I don't think he's ever going to commit another crime.
Yeah.
right? I think he's good. All right. Hunter
meth,
Biden
meth,
is a
Bi-
straight
meth
shooter.
Biden. Meth Biden.
2028. Okay,
Yeah,
he's
yeah.
totally straight shooter.
Uh-huh.
But the problem is, if we're looking,
That's
at
not.
this
That
as a
wasn't corrupt though, right? That was
No, I think it was. I
Oh,
think it
okay.
was. That's the whole point.
But
is
you
we're able
voted
to
for.
call
But
out
you
our own
voted for him
fucking
anyway.
side.
But you did vote for Biden, right? And he would have
Yeah,
voted.
it's called. I'm able to make an analysis. Of
Yeah.
which
Would you have
the
voted?
reasons
Would you have
absolutely
voted for him for a second term post him pardoning
I would
Hunter?
vote for Obama for a 5th term. Actually, in fact, I'm voting.
Wait,
for
Yeah,
Obama
yeah.
for
Without the
28
trolling,
when
can you
he-
just answer my question? If he
Oh
had
yeah, it's
pardoned,
not trolling when we're talking about fucking political violence, and now we're going
Yeah.
about Hunter Biden's son and all the crimes.
well,
he's
I'm just
doing.
looking for
He's lost in the
consistency.
fucking weeds
I'm
about
just
this.
looking
So
for
what I see
consistency.
here- what I see
Well, yeah,
here,
but every
and
time I
wanna-
try to
wanna
pry
really
you for
highlight this.
consistency, you
I
have to
really
keep
want to
running
highlight
away.
this.
I've
Well,
answered all of your
actually, no,
questions, dude.
I'm not cherry picking. I
Is-
just
Okay,
want
okay,
you to
okay,
have
I'm gonna
to
let
find
Soy
have to
somebody
go.
that
mention
agrees
this.
with me.
I have to mention this. Okay, so this is the biggest concession of the debate.
Yeah, because
Kamala
we're good
Harris
faith enough to say
actively-
this
Hold
is a
on,
bad
sorry, let
thing.
John-
You
let
will
John
not
Paul
say
finish.
this
I
is
understand.
bad.
Let John
I
Paul
will
finish.
agree with my premise. You will
Okay,
not
I
say
wanna
this
predicate-
about.
Here is where things get surgical, because Soy Pill, to his credit, is actually trying to be methodical. He sets a clear standard. He says, show me who she retweeted, show me what violent thing they did, and I will agree with you. He thought that was a wall. He thought there was no answer coming. John Paul walks straight through it. John Paul says directly, that is not an argument. That was just padding. And then he drops the name George Howard. George Howard was bailed out through the fund in August. Weeks later, still within that same month, he was back in custody on a serious charge, and the room goes quiet. Then Soy Pill says it. I am quoting him directly. I completely agree. I think that was incredibly irresponsible of Kamala Harris. This is the part that people need to actually sit with, because Soy Pill did not say that under pressure or cornered into a trap. He evaluated what John Paul gave him, and he agreed. He went further and said, you can even tie this directly to her and other politicians who retweeted it. That is an extraordinary moment, not because it proves some grand organized plan, but because it collapses the left's central moral position in this debate. Their entire argument was, our side condemns, our side takes responsibility, our side does not enable violence. And their own representative just said that one of the most prominent figures in their party enabled it directly with a documented paper trail during the worst of it. And that is not a small thing to say out loud on stream when your own side breaks ranks and agrees with the opposition on the core example they are making. That is not a talking point being lost. That is the foundation giving out underneath the entire argument.
Trump,
I
will
want to
you?
predicate.
You're gonna filibuster,
I
right?
really appreciate. No, I really appreciate the consistency, and I appreciate that you're willing to concede this. I'm saying this is the biggest, most substantial concession of the debate, because the Antifa and BLM riots of 2020 was the largest scope and scale of political violence, sustained political violence that we've seen in modern U.S. history. And when you have the vice president, the running vice president, and then the future leader of the party posting Minnesota Freedom Fund to bail out people like George Howard.
When was
That
George
is
Howard
absolutely
Shut
released?
your fucking
insane.
mouth and let him finish, Vince.
Oh,
August
whoa. No, I'm
6th.
not gonna-
August
I'm
6th, he
gonna-
was bailed out.
I'm
August
not
6th, he
gonna
was
take
bailed
words
out.
from
I'm not gonna do
John,
that. I'm not gonna
John,
do
hey, John,
that.
Andrew, shut the fuck
when
up.
was it, John?
I'm not
John,
gonna do
Let
that.
John Paul go.
John, let me ask you something.
Vince, just let John finish his thing, and then you
Okay.
can ask your question.
All right, I respect you, Corbin. Good.
Yeah, Vince,
Okay,
shut up.
Shut the fuck up, Andrew.
That he's one of many. I encourage you to look into the reports themselves. The fact is that Kamala Harris posted and encouraged people to donate to the Minnesota Freedom Fund, which was an which was an organization that was bailing out these violent people. That's one example. If I looked into it more, and I'm free to look into it more after this debate and give you all the examples of all the people who were arrested under violent charges and how that is directly that's monumentally impactful when Kamala Harris is the one posting this in the face of the Antifa and BLM riots, which are burning down cities, injuring officers, killing people. Yeah, once again, $2+ billion of damage. Somehow we're going to completely ignore the $2+ billion of damage when we're talking about responsibility and political violence. We have an actor in the mainstream left-wing political landscape who is functioning in such a way that is endorsing, rationalizing, excusing, tolerating the violence that we have seen. You can say that she condemns it, but when she condemns it and posts
And that's
the
the
Minnesota
debate. We
Freedom
win.
Fund, you have a glaring contradiction on your
We
hands.
win.
So real quick, Vince, I have
so
to answer this.
we
because
win.
We're talking, you're right, about political violence. So, for example, the specific
Soy.
instance you say,
Soy.
which I said
Soy.
was bad.
Soy.
Yeah.
So,
what?
dude, I promised Vince he could go, and he hasn't
Oh,
spoken.
I just
to
want to
you.
Sorry, go
respond to
ahead.
this one quick
Yeah, just-
thing. I
just
just
let
want to
Vince
make a
go, yeah.
small little asterisk to what John Paul is saying about George Howard. George Howard was released in 2021, a year after the tweet from Kamala Harris. It had nothing to do with the BLM protests. So again, at the time, Kamala Harris had no idea about this George Howard thing because it didn't even exist yet. So again, you want to bring up the George Howard incident. This is just a proxy of the actual bail fund itself and what it became, not what it was at the time in which Kamala Harris supported it. I just
I'm
want to
not
make that
making-
asterisk.
Yeah, I'm not making the claim that Kamala Harris specifically wanted to bail out George Howard. I'm making the claim that she's supporting a group that is functioning in such a way that is bailing out people like George Howard.
After,
Right.
after.
So, to be
After
Right,
clear,
that
she
is the
endorsed it.
function
Bailing
of the group that she is promoting.
Yeah, that's
And now John Paul goes fully into what this concession actually means in the bigger picture. The left's argument throughout this entire debate was about scale, about whose side created a worse climate, about whose political unrest was more sustained, more damaging, more organized. That was their frame, and John Paul points directly at it. Kamala Harris was posting that fundraising link in the face of the largest period of sustained political unrest in modern American history. Cities burning, $2 billion in damage, officers injured across the country. That was the backdrop. That was the specific moment in which she directed her platform toward that fund. Vince tries to recover. He points out that George Howard was released a full year after the post and that the case had nothing to do with the protests directly. And I want to give Vince credit here. That is actually a real point worth raising. Timelines matter. You should not casually link someone to an outcome when the direct chain of causation is not clean. But watch what John Paul does with it. He does not fight over George Howard specifically. He says, I am not claiming she wanted to bail out George Howard. I am claiming she promoted an organization that functions this way, that bailing out people like George Howard is what the fund actually did. Repeatedly, and this is worth understanding because it goes beyond this one debate. There is a principle in leadership and institutional accountability that has been applied consistently throughout history. You are responsible not just for your stated intentions, but for the foreseeable consequences of your endorsements. Political figures, executives, institutional leaders. This standard has been the benchmark across documented cases for decades. Endorsing a mission means owning what that mission actually produces, not just what it claims to stand for. Vince built his entire case on the idea that the right deflects, never owns consequences, never takes accountability for what their rhetoric produces. But when the most documented, most direct, example of a major political figure enabling a damaging cycle was placed in front of him. It was his own debate partner who looked at the evidence and called it incredibly irresponsible. You cannot spend 3 hours demanding accountability from one side and then look away the moment that same standard applies to yours. That is exactly the double standard John Paul identified at the very start. And by the end of this exchange, the left side had no answer for it. So what do you guys think of this? Leave your thoughts down in the comments. Please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.